On the morning of April 24th, 1967, a search helicopter circled over the steppe east of Orsk, near the border of the Kazakh SSR, one of the republics of the Soviet Union. Below, lying on its side, was a descent module, a scorched sphere about the size of a passenger car. Flames shot out from beneath it, and black smoke rose in a column for kilometers. The rescuers who rushed up began covering the capsule with dirt, using shovels and their bare hands. When the fire was extinguished, it became clear the irreversible had happened. A strange phrase was transmitted over the radio. The cosmonaut requires urgent medical assistance, not because there was any hope, but because the search service's code tables simply had no words for what had occurred. In 6 years of Soviet crewed spaceflight, no one had yet died during a space mission. Vladimir Komarov became the first. Komarov was not just a pilot, he was an engineer. The best engineer in the Cosmonaut Corps, he read the spacecraft's technical documentation, knew the lists of defects, and attended meetings where the designers argued until they were hoarse. He understood how unready the machine he was boarding really was, and yet he boarded it anyway. To understand why, we need to rewind to the moment when the Soviet space program lost its most important figure. January 1966. Sergei Korolev, the man who launched both the first satellite and Gagarin into space, dies on the operating table in Moscow. He is 59 years old. He is succeeded by his deputy, Vasily Mishin, a competent engineer, but without Korolev's authority or his ability to tell the Kremlin no. And very soon, someone would need to say no. By this point, the Soviet Union had not launched a human into space for almost 2 years, since March 1965. During that same period, the Americans had carried out 10 crewed missions under the Gemini program: rendezvous, spacewalks, and 2-week missions. The leader of the space race had quite clearly changed. And the calendar now read 1967, the 50th anniversary of the revolution. The country needed a triumph, not someday, by the anniversary. The planned triumph was elegant. On April 23rd, the new Soyuz-1 spacecraft would launch with a single pilot. The next day, Soyuz-2 would launch with 3 cosmonauts aboard. The 2 spacecraft would dock in orbit. 2 crew members would transfer from Soyuz-2 to Soyuz-1 via an extravehicular spacewalk in spacesuits outside the spacecraft, holding onto handrails, and then return to Earth aboard the other spacecraft. No one had ever done anything like this before, and all of it was to happen on the very first crewed flight of a completely new spacecraft. It is worth pausing here on one detail, because it explains everything that followed. Before its crewed launch, Soyuz had flown twice without a crew. The first uncrewed spacecraft, in November 1966, lost control in orbit and was deliberately destroyed. The second, in February 1967, suffered a burn-through in its heat shield during re-entry because a manufacturing plug had been left in place. The capsule landed on the ice of the Aral Sea and sank. 2 test flights, 2 accidents. By any engineering logic, a third uncrewed test should have followed. Instead, they decided to put a human aboard. That human was Vladimir Komarov, 40 years old, the oldest member of the original Cosmonaut Corps and the only one among them with a full academic engineering education. Behind his back, they called him the Professor. In 1964, he had already commanded Voskhod-1, the same insane mission on which they squeezed 3 men into the spacecraft without spacesuits, because all 3 simply would not fit if they wore them. Incidentally, they launched under Khrushchev, but reported their successful landing to Brezhnev. While the crew was in orbit, power had changed hands on Earth. Now Komarov was becoming the first Soviet cosmonaut to fly into space twice. Yuri Gagarin was assigned as his backup. Over the decades, an entire mythology grew around this assignment. Allegedly, Komarov told friends that he would not return from this mission but could not refuse, because if he did, Gagarin, the first human in space, would fly in his place and die instead. The archival documents do show that the spacecraft had many defects, that concerns about its lack of readiness were voiced openly, and that everyone understood where the pressure to meet the schedule came from the Kremlin. The night of April 23, 1967, Baikonur. At 3:35 a.m., the rocket lifts off, the first nighttime crewed launch in Soviet history. Komarov's call sign is Rubin. The first few minutes proceed normally. Ascent is nominal, but then begins what superstition would call a bad omen, and engineering would call a cascading failure. One of the two solar panels fails to deploy. The spacecraft instantly loses half of its electrical power and, worse still, becomes lopsided. An asymmetrical vehicle is excruciatingly difficult to orient. Then, the sun orientation sensor fails. The ion sensors work erratically. Komarov tries spinning the spacecraft to shake loose the jammed solar panel, but it does not budge. He attempts to orient the spacecraft manually. The spacecraft responds poorly. Mission Control quickly realizes that docking is out of the question. The launch of Soyuz-2, carrying 3 cosmonauts, is cancelled. The mission is reduced to a single line: bring Komarov back alive. Remember that cancellation? We will have to return to it later, and it will become the most chilling part of the entire story. Bringing him back is easier said than done. To deorbit, the spacecraft must be precisely oriented with its engine pointed opposite the direction of flight. And orientation is exactly where Soyuz-1 is in trouble. The automatic system fails twice. The orbit attempts on the 16th and 17th orbits are unsuccessful. Electrical power continues to drain away. One option remains, one that almost no one had truly practiced: manual orientation. On the 19th orbit, Komarov does something no one before him had ever done. He manually aligns the spacecraft while over the daylight side of Earth, passes through Earth's shadow while maintaining that orientation, and ignites the braking engine at exactly the right moment. It is masterful work by a pilot engineer flying a half-dead spacecraft. At Mission Control, everyone finally exhales. The engine performs as intended, the modules separate, and the descent module enters the atmosphere. The flight dynamics team reports: trajectory nominal, landing area, the Orenburg step. The hardest part is behind them. That's what everyone thought. At an altitude of about 10 kilometers, the drogue parachute deploys as expected. It is supposed to pull out the main parachute, a massive canopy covering 1,000 square meters. The drogue pulls and pulls, but it cannot extract the main chute from its container. The canopy is stuck fast inside. The automatic system senses that the descent speed is not decreasing and deploys the reserve parachute. And here, fate slams the final door shut. The reserve deploys, only to become immediately entangled in the lines of the flailing drogue parachute, which was never jettisoned. Not a single functioning canopy remains. The descent module falls almost in free fall and hits the ground at roughly 900 kilometers per hour. Komarov was buried with full state honors, cremation, an urn placed in the Kremlin wall, and nationwide mourning. The commission worked quickly, and what it found was almost unbearable in its ordinariness. No sabotage, no fatal pilot error. Technology. The descent modules underwent heat shield polymerization in an autoclave, and on production spacecraft, they were placed inside with the parachute containers left open. Volatile components of the coating settled on the inner walls of the containers, making them rough and sticky. A tightly packed canopy inside such a container became, in effect, glued to the interior. The drogue parachute simply could not generate enough force to pull it free. Now, about that cancelled launch. The Soyuz-2 spacecraft, which was supposed to launch the following day with Valery Bykovsky, Alexei Yeliseyev, and Yevgeny Krunov aboard, had exactly the same defect in its parachute container. And if Soyuz-2 had launched, then with high probability, 2 spacecraft would have crashed into the Orenburg steppe. 4 coffins instead of 1. And here, it's impossible not to look across the ocean. 3 months before Soyuz-1, on January 27, 1967, the crew of Apollo 1, Grissom, White, and Chaffee, burned to death on the launch pad in Florida in just 15 seconds. Again, there was haste. Again, an unfinished spacecraft. Again, a deadline breathing down everyone's neck. Kennedy had promised the moon before the end of the decade. After Komarov's death, Gagarin was forbidden to fly again. The world's first cosmonaut was considered too valuable to risk sending back into space. Fate judged that precaution in its own way. In March 1968, less than a year later, Gagarin was killed in a training fighter jet crash. 3 years after that, in 1971, the crew of Apollo 15 left a small aluminum sculpture on the moon, Fallen Astronaut, along with a plaque bearing the names of 14 fallen explorers of space. Vladimir Komarov's name stands on that list beside those of Grissom and White. On the moon, there are no borders between programs. What do you think about this? Is technological progress worth the lives of astronauts, even if they are heroically willing to accept the risk? And what would you do if you learned that the spacecraft on which you were about to fly had not been fully tested?